Kristalina, it is wonderful to have you. In fact, you're the first managing director of the International Monetary Fund we've had on a Devex stage. And I think part of that is because it's you. You know, the IMF is not an institution we long covered or that the global development community paid as much attention to, I think, until you took over this role. Obviously, this community knows you well from your time at ECHO, at the European Commission, at the World Bank. You've been in the development sector a really long time. I want to understand in a moment a bit about what you're doing at the IMF, but maybe we could just start with the moment we're in right now. We talked a bit about the food crisis. There's 345 million people now in acute hunger. You know, we have a debt crisis budding potentially, an energy crisis. You're at the center of these conversations. What do you think is actually going on?
Well, let me say, like you did in the beginning, it is great to be together. And to those in the room, fantastic to be able to interact with you. And to those who are online, well, very good to see you from far. Look, we have to recognize that there is a tectonic shift happening. We live in a world that is changing very rapidly. It is a more shock-prone world. And unfortunately, we have not been able to find a way to make a multipolar world functioning with no frictions. So we also have some fragmentation that certainly we should be concerned about. What we see now is a crisis upon a crisis, and possibly a third shock of tightening of financial conditions to come after the pandemic and on top of the war. So it is a tough time this year. It may be even tougher next year. Why? Because if in 2020, when we were hit by the pandemic, we were able to deploy policy coordination effectively and have monetary policy accommodating, in other words, help the economies and households and businesses, fiscal policy rowing in the same direction, help households, businesses, and countries. Today, we are in a very different place. Today, because of the combined impact of these shocks, of the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and then the horror of a war again in Europe, inflation has galloped up, and central banks, rightly so, concentrate on putting a lid on it. But when they do so, when monetary policy tightens, what does it mean for a world that accumulated more debt to handle the pandemic? Servicing this debt is more expensive, and when you top it with dollar appreciation, for countries that don't earn dollars but have to pay in dollars for their debt, it is twice as hard. So debt crisis in the making. And then we have, unfortunately, a repeat of 2007-2008 with the food crisis that is also triggered to a certain degree by the disruptions, by the war, and by climate change. And we don't talk enough about the role climate change plays in today's harsh conditions. The energy crisis primarily is driven by the war, yes, but we also need to recognize that it has exposed what? That we are slow on the transition to a low-carbon economy.
You know, this past weekend we all saw the images of people going to the presidential palace in Sri Lanka and jumping in the swimming pool, taking over the home of the president. You talk to a lot of world leaders of low and middle income countries. Are they feeling a sense of worry that this kind of disruption might happen? I mean, the last food crisis, we saw 45, 46 violent protests around the world, including the Arab Spring. Is this part of the zeitgeist in the discussions you're having now with world leaders?
Oh, definitely. This is becoming part of the conversation, and rightly so. Let's remember 2019. What did we have in 2019? Protests in Paris, in Lebanon, in Chile, and then COVID came and pushed us all to stay home. Now, the eruption of social discontent is very visible in quite a number of places. And I want to say to our audience the following. When your family cannot have the very basic, which is food, you will be on the street too. There is nothing more horrifying than to be deprived of not the luxury of food, but the basics of food. And that is now happening, unfortunately, in far too many places.
You mentioned the war in Ukraine, which certainly is one big part of it. And by the way, I don't know if the audience knows, you even have family that's there in Ukraine during the war. So it's very personal for you. But it's more than just the war, right? It's countries that are feeling worried about the food situation and saying we're going to maybe buy more and keep it. There's other countries saying we're going to export less. You're involved in these conversations with world leaders. Is there a sense yet that they're coming together to say, we need to ease these export controls, we need to provide some of the food we have in storage? What discussions are happening now?
Well, some of this is happening. One of the encouraging signs was the WTO meeting that actually came up with a declaration on eliminating barriers to food exports. Not happening fast enough. We still have about 30 countries that are restricting exports, and we do have a problem with rich countries being able to purchase bulk in advance. So what is the reaction? One piece of good news. Remember during the pandemic, the World Bank, IMF, WHO, WTO, we came together with the pandemic plan, and we actually did accelerate the movement of vaccines to shots in the arm in poor countries. We are repeating this virtually last week. We came together again, World Bank, WTO, because of the restrictions, the World Food Programme, FAO, and IMF, so we can have coordination and amplify our voices on three things. One, don't hoard food. Don't take more than you can eat in your plate, and you sure don't buy more than your country requires. And that includes elimination of restrictions. Two, focus on more production in developing countries, because if we have irrigation in developing countries, if we have more capacity to store food and process food in developing countries, there would be less hunger. And especially in the face of climate change, we need to adapt agriculture to what is coming and more to come. And three, make sure that there is a good fix on the financing for countries. Because if you are not recovering yet from COVID and you're hit by another crisis, you have what we at the fund deal with, which is financial constraints. You have your fiscal space doesn't exist anymore, and you have balance of payment constraints. So step up together with the hope that if we act quickly and we act together, we can achieve a better outcome. But it is worrisome. I mean, if fertilizers prices have jumped tremendously, yeah. So what does it mean? It means next year may be also problematic. I'm going to the G20, and one of the points I would be making there is, look, we have to pull together. So countries that have more capacity, please step forward. One thing that let me check with the audience whether we would agree on that, that hunger is the world's most pressing solvable problem. Because we produce enough food today to feed everybody, but we don't distribute this food to feed everybody.
So you're actually leaving, sorry. You're leaving in just a few minutes from this stage to get on a plane to the G20. And I'm curious, when you go there, do you feel like you're a lone voice on this issue? The G20 has so many big geopolitical questions they're grappling with. Or have they yet come to this point of realizing how immediate and severe the food, the energy, the debt crises may end up being for many countries that are low and middle income?
I'm cautiously optimistic that we are starting to grasp with the huge problem that the pandemic compounded by the war has created. And it is, for the first time in the last decades, instead of converging, poor countries are diverging, falling further behind. And this is not just a matter of suffering for their people, it is a matter of global security. In other words, people are seeing instability in so many places, and that is a wake-up call. So, in practical terms, this month, finally, we have a re-energized common framework for debt resolution. 3 countries asked for that resolution. None of the negotiations are completed, but within 10 days, the creditor committees for Zambia, for Chad, and for Ethiopia will meet. So I would ask you, send a vibration of, please come with an outcome. Because we need it for these countries and to energize other countries to step forward. There is a growing risk of a debt crisis. I want to spell it out as clearly as I can, and I will do that in the next days over there. Why? Because the level of debt has gone up during the pandemic. Financial conditions are tightening, more expensive to serve it. And as I mentioned before, for dollar-denominated debt, not a good place to be if you don't earn dollars. So when we look at the horizon, today, 30% of developing and emerging markets are either at or near debt distress. This doubles for low-income countries. 60% of low-income countries are there. So we don't act, guess what is going to happen? Not good for these countries, and certainly not good for financial stability.
You know, you don't talk like the usual managing director of the IMF. You mentioned some of the coalitions the IMF has been in under your leadership. They're a bit unusual. Some of the issues you're focused on are a bit different. You know, there's a moment, I showed a picture of Bretton Woods. There's a moment now, perhaps to rethink some of these institutions. Janet Yellen made a big speech to the US Secretary of Treasury about modernizing the Bretton Woods institutions. What does that mean for you at the IMF? Are you expanding your remit in some way? Or where do you fit versus the World Bank, versus other institutions in the global development space?
The IMF has a very clear mandate. It is macroeconomic and financial stability, growth and employment. Today, macroeconomic and financial stability are threatened more often not by domestic mismanagement, but by global, by exogenous shocks. So we have to rethink how we act more in the direction of supporting countries early, preemptively, building resilience to these shocks. And that goes beyond the traditional focus of financial sector fiscal policy. For example, I'm proud to say today the IMF is a systemically significant institution in the fight against climate change. Why? Because climate shocks undermine stability, macroeconomic financial stability, and with the flip side, Action on climate opens up opportunity for green growth and green jobs. So we are thinking of what is the role of our institution in a changing world. And we are not just thinking, we are acting on it. One of the big changes we have made was demonstrably at the time of the pandemic. First, we acted incredibly swiftly with emergency financing. If your economy is in a standstill and your revenues disappear, as it is the case, for example, in the Caribbean, your expenditures go up. You don't have time to wait for assessment and policy dialogue and all the rest. So we got 86 countries to receive, 86, just imagine, 86 countries to receive emergency financing. Second, together with our members, we agreed on 650 billion injection of liquidity through new allocation of special drawing rights. And now, today, we have, for the first time in our history, an on-lending mechanism. So if you're a country that does not need extra injection of liquidity, please lend it through us to those who need it at concessional terms. We have created an instrument called Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It is already $40 billion strong. First time the IMF can provide low-cost, long maturity financing to help countries transform their economies. 20 years maturity, 10.5-year grace. Never before we had anything like this. Why do we have it? Because the world is changing. Because countries have to transform and they need longer-term financing for it.
And just so the audience knows, I think the dance that you and your colleagues have had to dance inside the IMF is traditionalists would say you have to make sure everything you do is macro-critical. Macro-criticality is the term of art. And you have had to make the case that these are macro-critical issues. Climate is macro-critical.
It is, so look, social safety nets, they're macro-critical. If countries don't have them and they're hit by a shock, this creates misery, drags the economy backwards, long-lasting consequences. You have shown the consequence on learning from COVID. So should the IMF be working on sound social safety nets? And I'm asking you, should we, or it is not for us? Yes, yes. So or climate. How can we say, who on this planet can say that climate shocks don't matter for financial and macro stability? Somebody in this audience? Let me check. No. And yes, I have to argue for that, but I'll tell you something. We have board-approved strategy on climate. It's not just Kristalina saying it's an important thing to do. We have a board-approved strategy. We have now our membership looking at us and saying, the world is changing. We count on you to lean forward in these changes. And I personally believe, and I would end with this, what does it mean to lean forward? It means to adopt a much broader concept of resilience. After the global financial crisis, we said we need resilient banking sector. And actually, it is much more resilient today. But that is not enough. The pandemic and the war tell us that we have to think of resilience in a comprehensive way. Resilient people, educated, healthy, with sound social protection under their feet. Resilient society, not just economy, one that is more inclusive, where there is a sense of fairness, where nobody fears that children would go to bed hungry. And of course, a resilient planet. So we have to think how macroeconomic policies align with that concept of resilience, and what is our role? What can we do to make the world a better place?
Well, that fits so well with the theme of Devex World. We will end there, and we will wish you a very successful G20 meeting. We will all be paying a lot of attention to what comes of it. Thank you, Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF. Thank you.
Thank you.